You are standing in a stone room beneath Rome. The crowd above you is already cheering. And they are not cheering for you. It is the morning of a Roman triumph. The year is 29 BC. The city has been building toward this day for months, and somewhere in the streets above, 500,000 people are waiting to see what conquest looks like in human form. You are about to show them. A lamp throws orange light across cold stone. A woman's hands are working quickly, smoothing fabric across shoulders, checking the set of the collar, confirming what needs to be confirmed before the door opens. Her hands are shaking. The woman she is dressing has not slept. Neither has she. This is not a prison. That is the first thing to understand. A prison holds people. This room is something more precise, a staging area. The women inside it are not being hidden. They are being prepared. The second thing, a Roman soldier came before dawn, carrying something on a small cushion. He set it down and left without speaking. It was a thin band of gold, a diadem, the kind worn only by rulers of the Hellenistic world, the kind that means I am sovereign here. He returned it to them. The attendant did not understand why. She placed it with the other items and said nothing. From above, indistinctly but unmistakably, a name, not spoken, chanted. A foreign name being crushed into Latin syllables, losing its honorific in compression, becoming something smaller than it was. The queen closes her eyes, then opens them. She has made a decision about her face, and she is wearing it now. From further above, a man's voice begins a formal invocation of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. The ritual has started. They were not informed it had started. The door handle turns. The Roman triumph, the triumphus, was not a celebration invented spontaneously on the field of victory. Contemporary records, including the detailed accounts preserved by Livy and later by Plutarch and Valerius Maximus, confirmed that it was among the most precisely regulated state rituals in the ancient world. A general could not simply declare a triumph. The Senate voted on it. Religious authorities confirmed it. The procession itself followed a codified order that had been refined across centuries. Musicians then plundered treasures, then painted placards depicting conquered cities, then the captives, then the general in his chariot, then his army. Every position in that procession was legally assigned. The captives walked ahead of the general's chariot. Ahead, meaning visible, exposed, leading the spectacle. They were required to wear the regalia of their defeated kingdoms, not Roman clothing. Their own, rendered now as costume, as evidence, as proof of what Rome had undone. This detail was not logistical. It was theological, because the triumph was not merely a military ceremony. For the duration of the procession, the Roman general embodied Jupiter himself. His face was painted red, the color of the god. He carried a scepter topped with an eagle. A slave stood behind him in the chariot, holding a laurel wreath above his head and whispering repeatedly, "You are mortal, you are mortal." The reminder was necessary because, for those hours, the distinction was genuinely unclear, which means the captive walking ahead of him was not simply a defeated enemy. She was the embodied world that Jupiter had conquered, and the Senate had already decided, before she arrived in Rome, exactly what would happen to her when the procession ended. She was never told what that decision was. The Romans had a word for it, res. It means thing. It appears in Roman property law to describe objects, land, livestock, anything that could be owned, transferred, or disposed of after a triumph. It was a precise legal classification of every captive who walked in the procession, not prisoner, not enemy, not even slave, which carried its own legal personhood. Res, a thing captured in war. This is not interpretation. This is a language of Roman jurisprudence, preserved in sources including the Digest of Justinian, which compiled centuries of Roman legal precedent. A conquered foreign ruler, regardless of the kingdom she commanded, arrived in Rome with no legal standing whatsoever. She could not petition. She could not negotiate. She could not be wronged in any juridical sense, because wrong requires a person, and she was no longer classified as one. The Senate had 4 options. First, execution, carried out in the Tullianum, the stone chamber cut into the rock beneath the Capitoline Hill, immediately after the triumph concluded, before the sacrificial fires on the altar of Jupiter had gone cold. This was the documented fate of Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who walked in Caesar's triumph and was strangled in the dark below the hill while the crowd above celebrated. It was considered and formally debated for others. Second, permanent display captivity, housed, fed, produced at ceremonial occasions as living proof of Roman reach. Third, installation as a client ruler, sovereignty stripped, identity rebranded, returned to a diminished territory to govern on Rome's behalf. Fourth, absorption through marriage into Roman aristocratic structure, the royal lineage dissolved into someone else's family name. What all four outcomes share is a fact the ancient sources record without commentary. The woman had no mechanism to influence which one she received. None. The decision was administrative. She was notified, or she was not. But the chroniclers hint at a fifth possibility, one they name only in passing, in subordinate clauses, as though reluctant to look at it directly. It appears in scattered references across multiple sources, and it is the outcome the women in these accounts seem to have feared with specificity that suggests they understood it clearly. The ancient texts do not elaborate. They move on. We will return to it. Back on the Via Sacra, the procession is moving. The sun is directly overhead now, and the heat off the stone is coming up to the soles of her feet. The attendant walks several paces behind the queen, close enough to see the set of her shoulders, too far to speak. The diadem is on the queen's head, catching the light in intervals as she moves through shadow and sun. The crowd sound is not what the attendant expected. She had imagined anger or contempt. What she hears instead is stranger, a sustained festive roar with a current of something almost tender running beneath it. She looks at the faces nearest her and finds the word for it. Pity, performed, curated, entirely self-directed pity. The pleasure feeling generous towards someone you destroyed. Several Roman women near the front are weeping openly. The queen sees them. The attendant watches the queen see them. And then she watches something happen in the queen's posture, a minute recalibration, a degree of elevation in the chin, a steadying of the spine. That is not defiance to the crowd. The crowd is not the audience for this gesture. The attendant is. It means, I see exactly what this is. A soldier beside the attendant mutters something. She catches one word. The Latin name for the chamber below the hill. At the base of the Capitoline steps, the procession stops. The general dismounts. A courier approaches him with a sealed document. He reads it. He looks once toward the captives. His expression does not change. Pull back from the procession. Step away from the Via Sacra and into the archive, because what happens next cannot be understood without first understanding what the Romans chose to write down, and what they chose with equal deliberateness not to. Open any major Roman account of a conquered queen, and you will notice the same structural absence almost immediately. The exterior is richly documented. Her appearance, her bearing, her effect on the crowd. Plutarch describes the Macedonian royal children in Perseus' triumph with precise emotional notation. The crowd wept, he tells us, because the children were young and did not understand what was happening to them. He records the crowd's response in 4 sentences. He records what Perseus said during the procession in 0. The silence is not an oversight. Roman historical writing was not transcription. It was argument, and the argument required the conquered to remain legible only as objects of Roman feeling. The pattern holds across centuries and across queens. When Cleopatra took deliberate steps to deprive Octavian of her presence in his triumph, a documented act of political calculation that ancient sources confirm required planning, preparation, and precise timing, Roman historians encoded it as vanity, as feminine excess, as the inability to endure the public gaze. The political logic was scrubbed and replaced with a character flaw that confirmed what Roman audiences already believed about women who ruled. The Historia Augusta, writing of Zenobia Palmyra generations after her defeat, describes her in one breath as a military commander who drilled her own infantry and rode without a carriage across desert campaigns, and in the next breath pivots, without transition, to her contentment in a Roman villa, her dinner parties, her philosophical conversations with visiting scholars. The pivot is not argued. It is simply performed. Scholars now call this pattern narrative assimilation. The logic applied to the queen's body after conquest, classify, contain, redeploy, was applied identically to her story. She was not erased. Erasure leaves a gap and gaps invite questions. She was rewritten, which is cleaner. A rewritten woman takes up the same space in a record as a real one. She just no longer says anything inconvenient. Here is a verifiable and specific problem. The two primary Roman sources for Zenobia's post-triumph fate directly contradict each other on the most basic facts. One account places her in chains at Aurelian's triumph, humiliated and diminished. Another describes her arriving in such splendor, gold, jewels, a retinue, that the crowd was more awed than contemptuous. These are not different interpretations of ambiguous evidence. They are incompatible accounts of a single public event witnessed by hundreds of thousands of people. At least one Roman historian is lying. The more unsettling possibility is that both are in different directions for different purposes. Now return to the opening scene. The soldier who brought the diadem before dawn. You were told that detail and invited to receive it as an act of either carelessness or obscure kindness. It was neither. Roman triumphal law, codified in the protocols reconstructed from Livy and Valerius Maximus, require that captured rulers be displayed in their sovereign regalia. The diadem was not returned to the queen. It was delivered to the prop. The soldier was following a legal instruction, not making a human choice. And the queen knew this. She had known it before he knocked. The question of whether to wear it was never really a question about the diadem. It was a question about whether to cooperate with her own reframing, whether to stand inside Rome's theater and play the role Rome had written, because the alternative was to provide Rome with a different but equally usable story. She put it on. That was not surrender. That was the only move available on that board. The question is no longer whether she survived the day. The question is what Rome meant when it used the word survive. The procession ended in the late afternoon. The general completed his sacrifices on the Capitoline. The captives were held in a series of antechambers, while the administrative decisions that had already been made were formally processed. The attendant was placed in a room. She could not leave. The queen was placed in a room. She could not see from there. What the attendant could do was listen. Official Latin, unhurried. The cadence of bureaucratic procedure. A door opening and closing. Then a woman's voice, her queen's voice, saying something in a register, so controlled it took the attendant a moment to identify it. Not elevated, not broken. Controlled the way a person is controlled when they already know the answer and are simply waiting for the question to finish. Through a gap in the door, the attendant saw a Roman official carrying a small wooden case, the kind used under Roman property confiscation procedures to transport items of material value. The diadem was no longer on the queen's head. The attendant did not know at what point during the afternoon it had been removed. She had been watching, and she had still missed it. The voices in the other room stopped. Footsteps crossed the floor. A Roman soldier opened the attendant's door and used a single Latin phrase. She translated it internally and found it sat precisely between two meanings, kept and retained as property. He was waiting for a response. She asked the question she had been constructing since the procession began. The one about her queen, about where, about what classification. He answered with a word she did not fully recognize. But the word before was a place name, and she knew that place. Consider two women. One was 10 years old when she walked in chains through Rome. The other commanded an empire that stretched from Egypt to Anatolia before a Roman army took it apart legion by legion across 2 years of open warfare. Their fates, as documented in the ancient record, tell us more about Roman strategy than Roman mercy, because mercy had nothing to do with either of them. Cleopatra Selene, too, daughter of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, appears in the historical record as a child prop. Octavian's triumph of 29 BCE is documented in multiple sources, and so confirm that the royal children walked in procession bearing golden chains fashioned in the shape of the Nile, a detail so precisely theatrical it could only have been designed. She survived. Her brothers did not, or at least they disappear from every record with completeness that is its own kind of answer. She was transferred to the household of Octavia, her father's Roman wife, her mother's political enemy, and raised there, her Ptolemaic identity systematically replaced with a Roman-adjacent one. Years later, she was married to Juba II of Mauritania and installed as queen of a client kingdom on Rome's terms, at Rome's convenience, for Rome's purposes. She named her son Ptolemy. Historians have debated for generations what that name meant. survival strategy, quiet mourning, an act of defiance so subtle it could never be punished. The ancient sources do not say. She left no writings. Nothing attributed to her voice survives. Zenobia Palmyra defeated Roman forces in the field, seized Egypt, minted her own coinage bearing her portrait, and declared her son Augustus, a direct challenge to Roman imperial authority so explicit it could not be absorbed or reframed. It had to be answered militarily. Aurelian answered it. After her capture, the Historia Augusta, unreliable, late, and politically motivated, but the primary source we have, describes her in a Roman villa in Tiber, surrounded by philosophers and dinner guests. Content. No source written by Zenobia survives. No letter, no decree, no inscription that carries her own account of what Tiber felt like after Palmyra. The Roman record gives us a woman who made peace with her circumstances. We have no way to verify that woman existed. What both cases share, and what the documentary record shows consistently across conquered queens, is a specific archival signature, dense physical description, almost no recorded speech. Roman sources can tell you how Zenobia looked in chains at her triumph, the way of the gold fetters, the color of her jewels, with more precision than they can tell you anything she said or decided after procession ended. This is not random preservation. Contemporary records about Roman men of equivalent status are heavy with quoted speech, attributed decisions, documented negotiations. The silence around these women's inner lives is structural. Roman historical epistemology held that the conquered woman's body was evidence. Her mind was irrelevant to the record being constructed. The diadem had moved again. The attendant found it weeks later, or what she believed was weeks, time having lost its reliable shape, in the reception room of the Roman household where she had been assigned. It was on a side table among decorative objects, a small bronze, a Greek amphora, a polished mirror, the kind of arrangement a wealthy Roman woman constructed to signal cultural breadth, aesthetic refinement. Familiarity with the wider world her husband's military service had made available to her. A guest picked up the diadem and turned it in the lamplight, said something. The other women in the room responded with the particular laughter of people who find an object charming precisely because it is foreign and small and no longer dangerous. The attendant was near the window, performing a task with her hands. She did not stop performing it. She did not change her face. She looked at the diadem for 3 seconds. She counted. And then she looked at the wall. She had been told, through an intermediary, that her queen was alive. The word had arrived correctly conjugated, and she had received it correctly conjugated, and both of them knew that alive now meant something it had not meant a year before. It meant housed. It meant contained. It meant assigned a shape that Rome found useful, and stripped of every shape Rome did not. The official record did not preserve her, but the official record could not entirely close behind her, either, and that gap, narrow, inconsistent, easy to miss, is where the counter-archive lives. The triumphal system's final and most enduring innovation was not the procession. The narrative architecture Rome built around its conquered queens has lasted 2,000 years. She is still there on the coins, on the friezes, on every allegorical figure of triumphant empire across 2 millennia of Western visual culture. The diadem catches the light exactly as it did on the Via Sacra. The crowd is still cheering. It has never entirely stopped.